Very special thanks once again to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury. They're always a pleasure to work with, and typically this isn't the kind of car that they would sell and that I would test drive from them, but if you want to check out what they do currently have in stock, Jags, Mercs, Bentleys, Rolls Royces even, then of course click the link down in the description and give them a look. If you look back through the history of the British sports car, especially smaller ones, I'm not talking Jags and Astons, but the smaller kind of quintessentially British sports car marques, there tend to be two distinct camps, at least in my opinion, that most of those cars fall into. On the one hand, you've got the cars which are more extreme. They are legendary even outside of the UK. They tend to be considered as the benchmark of a British sports car, sometimes even to the point of being challenging to drive. Something like, of course, a TVR, maybe a Noble, a Marcos perhaps, and even something like a Caterham, a Lotus, or an Ariel. Then on the other hand, you have something which isn't done quite as much these days, but it certainly was back in the day. Companies such as MG, Triumph with the Spitfire, even something like Vauxhall with the convertible Tigra in a kind of similar way. These cars which are, yes, technically sports cars, but they're small, they're relatively low in terms of power and performance, and they're affordable. They're not really designed for the same kind of market as something like a TVR. They're designed for somebody who doesn't want face-ripping performance, but who does want something that is affordable, small, manageable, and just fun. Just simple fun. Almost like a road-legal go-kart, in effect. It doesn't need 300, 400, 500 horsepower. It doesn't need to be race-bred, necessarily, or something that you have to build yourself. It could even have a little bit of comfort. Maybe a radio, even. And this is the kind of car that falls into that category, in my opinion. But the MGF, because of course it's had a longer lineage than this, first there was the F in the 90s and then the TF, which this one is, a facelift visually. I personally think it does look a little bit nicer. There was technically another one after this as well, when the Chinese owners of the brand tried to bring it back again. Didn't really succeed though. This one tends to be the car that you'll see more of, generally speaking, and the prices are still pretty low, even though it is the facelifted model. Now, there are a number of different engine options, all the way up to the 160, and I will say, before we go any further with this review, if you are looking for the best performance, definitely go for that one, because the TF160 is actually a pretty impressive little sports car, especially if you're not used to considering something like that. If you think of small British sports cars, the vast majority of people think of Lotus first, something like an Elise for instance. And yes, it's a great little car, but you're going to be paying quite a lot more for an Elise than you would for something like this. But consider what you get. A 1.8 engine, 160 horsepower, manual gearbox, mid-engine, and 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds. That's pretty good. Now, this model is not that one. This is a very intriguing model, technically a lower one in the tree, called the Stepspeed. Now, this is a car which many of you are probably not familiar with, unless you're like an existing fan of the MGTF range, but the Stepspeed is in fact a CVT gearbox. Now, I'm not going to hugely get into CVTs because this will quickly go from being a car review to an engineering video, but suffice it to say it's a fascinating gearbox, or transmission if you want to refer to it that way, because it technically doesn't have gears, and that's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to look into. So if you're not familiar with that, I would strongly urge you to check out the CVT transmission online. But basically what it means is you have a vehicle that is ostensibly an automatic, really, but at the same time it doesn't feel like one, because unlike most automatics, especially slightly older ones from the 90s or earlier 2000s, there's no clunk into a new gear. It's basically seamless. In fact, it's about as close as you can have in a traditional combustion engine as feeling like an electric car's acceleration. That just kind of twist and go mentality where you just put your foot down and the car just goes, and it never has that brake to change a gear. It actually feels really cool. You can even put it into a simulated manual mode with those odd looking little buttons on the steering wheel and kind of simulate the idea of having gears. It's a fascinating setup and a surprisingly ambitious one, I would say, for a car like this. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's also ambitious is not just because of that certain reputation that British cars have, especially sports cars, for reliability or a lack thereof, but more so because they chose kind of a weird model to put that gearbox on, because this one does have the 1.8 straight 4 engine. It is of course still mid-mounted rear-wheel drive, but it's not the 160, and that brings me to the problem with the car. It's underpowered. This is a 120 horsepower car. And even though in comparison to that power, the torque is actually pretty good, it's more in fact, 122 pound-feet, that's just not enough to justify being a sports car that could be so much better. The CVT in particular could easily allow the car to be much quicker, but because it's just got no power to work with, the 0 to 60 comes off as just under 10 seconds, which is barely quicker than the Rolls-Royce that I reviewed from 1990, which weighs a whole lot more, and even the top speed is only up around 120 miles an hour. Now, of course, the top speed doesn't matter too much because you're not going to use that most of the time, but the real question is, does this car merit your attention? Because I already said, if you're looking purely for performance, and if you don't care about having that unique gearbox, well, by all means go for the full manual 160, because it is the quickest one. However, I believe that this car actually does have a market. The problem is, I think that most of this car's market are not watching this video. And that kind of clues you into what I mean. I believe that this is in fact one of the most perfect sports car choices for an older person. And to be honest, the reason why I say that is not the reason that you might think. I don't say that this is a good older person's car because it's slow. It's actually more so because of ease of use. See, having that CVT gearbox, even more so than an automatic, is just so simple to use. And it means that the performance is not only easier, such as an automatic already would be, but it's also more accessible in terms of just flooring it and having fun. So you don't have to wait for the car to step down a gear, it just goes. Now, it would just go if it had more power. But that again brings me back to that issue, because the car makes a whole lot of noise and then kind of starts to get going. As you can see in the video, even when I put my foot down, there's a lot more noise than there is actually performance. However, that's still not a bad thing for that group of people. A group of people who want something small, light, fun through corners, that's not overly expensive, not overly powerful, certainly not challenging to drive, and something which crucially has that kind of almost classic British pluck, if you will. I'm not even going to call it charm, because it's beyond that. There are plenty of cars that are charming even from multiple countries, but there is that certain plucky attitude which is quintessentially British, really. It's something which a lot of small British sports cars are known for, not just sports cars, even a lot of just British classics in general, and this definitely has that. It's not the best built thing around, it's not the most well equipped, it certainly looks dated from the interior point of view, and it still definitely holds to those 90s roots. Even though it's from the 2000s and a facelift, etc., it manages to have a decent sized engine but not a huge amount of performance. These are all very British things. But I can also tell you that the one time that all of that melts away and doesn't matter at all is when you get to a twisty road. Because when you combine the fact that it has a low amount of power, which in other words means you can use all of it, you never have to hold back in this car. And that is actually something which also as a motorcycle rider I fully appreciate, because to slightly digress for a second because it is pertinent to the car, if you take a 600 to 1000cc superbike around a particular circuit, unless you're a seasoned professional driver, or rider I should say, you're not going to get the most out of that bike, even if it's something like a BMW HP4 that does a lot of the work for you. On the other hand, if you get something like a 125 or a 250, you're using all of that power and having all of that fun, because it's smaller, lighter, quicker through corners, more nimble, more fun. It's not as powerful, certainly would never keep up in a straight line, but that's not really where you're having fun. You're having fun in the twisty bits. And that, even with its lack of performance, is really where this car comes into its own. In fact, I would say that this is a prime vehicle for, as I said earlier on, a slightly older person, but crucially even more so, somebody who would love to own a classic British sports car, something like a Triumph Spitfire, or like an older MG, or some other smaller brand, maybe a Mini Marcos or something. But maybe they can't afford that, because those classics are going up in price. Something like a tiny little Ginetta, for example, is another perfect one, or an older Lotus. They are not particularly affordable cars. This is affordable, and it gives you essentially the modern kind of interpretation, because it still doesn't feel that modern, of that spirit. This is kind of like a modern day Triumph Spitfire, and that is something which a lot of older people, especially in the UK, I think would really appreciate. The ease of use, the affordability and just the sheer fun and go-kart-esque nature that the car has through corners is actually surprisingly appealing. With that being said, it's not the kind of car I would ever want to buy, but that's simply because it's not my kind of car. Now, to speak for just a second on the practicality, because of course it's always something that's beneficial to know, let's talk about two things: interior and then fuel economy, because those are the two things that will tend to matter the most on a day-to-day basis. I already mentioned the fact that it does look dated. It definitely does. It has a simple looking interior. It's easy to use because there's not that much to use. Space-wise, as you can see, I look kind of like Donkey Kong in a go-kart, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this car if you're over 6 feet tall, because you will be cramped. And don't ride it, or don't drive it I should say, for a long time, because you will get a bad back if you are that tall. But with that to one side, it's a perfectly fine, acceptable, simple little interior for a car that is, at the end of the day, not that expensive, so what do you expect? But to get into that fuel economy for just a second, it's actually pretty good, and with only 120 horsepower, you'd hope so. Despite the fact that it is a 1.8 litre, it does between 33 and 35 to the gallon on average, and can even get up around 40 or even more on the highway. So pretty good in terms of economy as well, and again, that is a way in which it is improved over the classic sports cars of days gone by, such as the carburettor versions of these kind of things from the 60s, 70s, 80s. So it does have advantages over that kind of era, but a lot of the same spirit. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier on, there's definitely a group of people, however niched, who will appreciate that. But what about you? What do you think of the car? Are you an existing owner? Have you owned one in the past? Tell me down below what your thoughts on the F or the TF, all the way up to the 160, maybe even this Stepspeed are. Is it something you would be interested in? Have you already owned one? Give us some stories down below, good or bad, for other potential owners to look into. But if you are new to the channel, of course, be sure to hit the notification bell to see my new videos, and click right here on screen to see all of my other car reviews as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.